First of all, I wanted to, if we don't get another chance, I wanted to thank Ryan Dean for all their hard work on this conference. It's been excellent and thought-provoking and challenging. And I was saying to Stephen, I'm very tired, and we're talking about issues that I care about profoundly. So I'm apologizing now if I get emotional. It often happens, so I just want to warn you now. So what I'd like to do is simply introduce my other two colleagues and turn to them to say a few words. And I'm going to start with Udloriak Hanson. Udlu is Chief Operating Officer with Nunavut Tunngavik Incorporated. NTI is the acronym. The land claims organization representing Nunavut Inuit. She is also NTI's chief negotiator for devolution. Udlu served as a senior advisor to the clerk of the Executive Council for the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador on Aboriginal issues and Arctic economic opportunities. She's also served as executive director and special advisor to Mary Simon, president of the Inuit Katatami, the national organization representing Inuit across Canada. And of course, Mary Simon is co-chair of Canadians for New Partnership. So Udlu serves on a number of boards across the country, and she is a proud member of Canadians for a New Partnership. She resides in Iqaluit, Nunavut, where she was born and raised. And then the other colleague I have with me is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Canadians for a New Partnership, Stephen Kakfwi. Many of you know Stephen. He's been instrumental in advancing Aboriginal land and self-government rights in the Northwest Territories for Dene, Metis and Inuit. He's had a distinguished career in public government, promoting the Northwest Territories' political, constitutional, and economic development. He's a former Premier of the Northwest Territories and a former President of the Dene Nation. Currently, he's working with us on Canadians for a New Partnership on reconciliation and building relations between First Nations, First Peoples, and all Canadians. But that's not all he does. He promotes community development in the Northwest Territories Aboriginal settlements and nationally. And he's also working on balancing approaches to conservation and the development of northern resources. So I'm going to call on Stephen to come up here first. Stephen?
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation and a chance to say a few words. In conferences like this, very often I feel like it's the people that we haven't heard before that we need to make room to hear. I find there's different realities in this country. There's the one that I deal with, which is with former premiers and prime ministers, heads of government, foundations, churches. And we all think things are going well. There's good indicators out there. We all want to do something great. There's also the reality of where our people are at home. Frustrated, living in poverty, lack of resources, a dysfunctional, devastated people. I have a younger brother who, after 10 years of work, finally became sober 2.5 years ago. And we finally are talking and visiting each other like we should have all our lives. The sadness of it is, while I celebrate that every day, to have my brother with me, I also know he has a son who he had neglected during those years of drinking, and now his son just turned 13 and is turning to alcohol. He called me last night, and he's been working with me, this young 13-year-old. And I say that because I come here to the conference and I hear voices of hope and voices steeped in anger. We're angry because this is not the way we're supposed to live. We come from a proud people, strong people, hardworking people. And yet our families are devastated, our communities are devastated. We don't have the resources to rebuild. In the Second World War, after our countries bombed the bejesus out of Germany and Japan, not even a week later, we were compiling hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild those very countries. This is what is called for in Canada. After a few hundred years of trying every which way to rid this country of Indigenous people, to bring us to our knees, to wipe us off the face of the earth, this country needs to put a plan together, the resources together, to rebuild every individual that's out on the street, every individual that's incarcerated, every child that is floundering, that is not making it through school, every community that is dealing with suicides, to improve our access to health, to education, to clean water, the most basic things. And we should also remember that the governments and the church groups did not come out of the kindness of their hearts and say, hey, we want to have reconciliation with you. They did it because we took court action. We brought them to court. That is why it happened. We brought the government to court, the churches, and we had a settlement. So we should remember how it started. And yes, now we have many hands offering to work with us. We want to help. We want to do things. And yet, I accept the skepticism, the lack of trust that is out there, that I hear in the voices of the Indigenous people that say, fine. I mean, where have we heard you before? We haven't seen anything yet. We haven't seen anything yet. So we're going to have reconciliation. It's going to take a little while to develop that trust, where people will take your hand that you're offering. You know, we're still raging. We're still devastated. We're still trying to find our place again, find our children, find our families, find our communities. And yet, in the middle of all this, when Idle No More was born, when our national leaders were fighting on TV in December of 2012, when Chief Teresa Spence was fasting, out of sheer frustration for the lack of support from the federal government to deal with the most basic things that our people need, like housing, some of us started calling each other, because my children came and said, "Can you do something?" Our elected leaders are not providing the vision and the leadership we need. We're losing hope. Out of that came phone calls to people like Ovid Mercury, Mary Simon, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, Michael Jean, the former Governor General. As I said, Phil Fontaine, Ovid Mercury, Miles Richardson. And everybody said, let's get together, let's try to do something, let's create some hope. Let's show the rest of the country that in spite of where we are, and whether we truly understand what nation to nation means, and what treaties actually mean, and what reconciliation means, let us get together as diverse as we are and see if we could do something together. So Paul Martin, Joe Clark, Sheila Fraser, the former Auditor General, myself, Phil Fontaine, Ovid Mercury, Miles Richardson, amongst others, with a group of young people from the Northwest Territories, met and said, let's see if we could show Canada, as diverse as we are, if we could do something together. And that's where Canadians for a New Partnership came. There were skeptics that said, same old, but we start where we are. If we're down on the ground, we have to stand up on our own 2 feet. If we don't understand each other, then we work at understanding one another. And it's astounding to hear Joe Clark and Paul Martin sit beside each other. And as you know, Ovid Mercury and Phil Fontaine working together, set aside our differences and say, let's agree on doing a few things together. Which brings me to say, so what is it that we wanted to do? We wanted to show Canada that a group of us on our own, on a volunteer basis, are willing to work together to show you how we can all try and work at reconciliation. That we need to create a national network. There are conferences and organizations working like silos across this country. There's this conference. There's going to be others in the weeks and months ahead. We need somehow to connect and coordinate and create a network so we know who we are, so we know what the churches are doing. We know what the provinces are doing. We know what the cities of Vancouver and Edmonton and Winnipeg are doing. What is the federal government doing? What is the province of Ontario doing? What is Alberta doing? We need to share that so as we go across the country, we remind people. Do you have a copy of the calls to action? Because I believe every one of us should be carrying one and read it every week. Look at it. It is a good way to start because it compels us to understand it and to set the expectations that we need. So we need to rebuild the nations. We know that. While we're working on reconciliation and having conferences and making plans as provincial governments and federal governments, we also know the incredible healing that still needs to be done by our people, the Inuit, the Metis, the First Nations. That I'm doing it with my family, one at a time. The Healing Foundation doesn't have money anymore. So where are the resources that our people need to continue the healing? We need it for another 50 years. That's how long it's going to take. As we heal my brother, now we have to go and work with his children. It is a long piece of work to be done. We need the Inuit to have the resources so they can go right through their communities and begin that. They're alone up in the Arctic. We need to work with the Métis, and we need to work with every First Nation across this country. We have to reach out to every woman that's ever been abused. We have to reach out to the children. We have to reach out to the men. Rebuild the families, rebuild the communities, rebuild the nations. And yes, we need the water, we need the housing, we need the roads. And yes, we need constitutional changes, we need to set up institutions, we need to set up different policies. But the most important thing for me is to rebuild the nations. That once we get back on our feet and we are sane again and in control of our capacities, we can do great things. I say together as a country we need a 50-year plan. It has to involve education. We need to focus on the calls to action. And for me, just judging from the discussion we had this morning, two things. One is the National Council on Reconciliation. We need to set up, and it's not a lot of work, to put in legislation a National Council on Reconciliation that will act as an Auditor General for reconciliation. So every year this office will stand up in front of all Canadians and say, here is what the federal government has done and not done, and here's what they've done well. In the province of Alberta, here's what they've tried to do, and here's what they've done well and has not done. To the cities, to the police forces, the universities, every institution and group across this country will get a mention and a report, the state of reconciliation, from one end of this country to the other, north, south, east, west. We need to push for a 50-year plan so everybody is working together. We don't need everybody to work on the same calls for reconciliation. I say those with the bags of money should look at setting up the National Trust. So far, I haven't heard one group say, hey, I got a little bit of money, I'm gonna help implement the National Trust, which is tied to the National Council on Reconciliation. I have 2 lawyers that have volunteered to start drafting what this trust would look like. But it's amazing, eh? So the churches have a little bit of money, charitable organizations. We're going to be calling on them to step forward and say, here's my $5, whatever it is they're going to contribute. So TRC calls to action, I think all of us have to carry it. I do that and I read it on the plane, and I'm on a plane just about every week. We need to create the network, the capacity. Canadians for New Partnership is trying to lead that. So we stay in touch with Reconciliation Canada, with Kairos, with the universities, with the church groups, with the charitable organizations, with the provinces. We're trying to meet with the premiers and the ministers of education. And then we need to talk about who is out there, what is it that they're good at, what is it that they want to do, when are they going to get started, and how are they going to do it. Because paramount in this is, if you want to do something, then do it with us. Don't make a plan and don't ask us for suggestions and run back to your little organizations and make a plan for us. It's not going to work. You have to bring us into the corporate planning boardrooms of this country, into the groups that run the churches and the charitable organizations and the universities, and help us. Get into the room so we are part of the planning on everything that happens. Because it's never worked where people get together and make plans for us. It has never worked, and it's not going to work now. So that was the reality check for me. There's full of hope. We have the Prime Minister that says, nation to nation, implement the UN Declaration. We're going to implement 94 calls to action, even though 94 doesn't apply to him, just some of them do. But I like it. I like the exuberance. You know, I like that. I don't like the cautious, well, we got to wait and see and have some deep consultations. I like Trudeau's enthusiasm. I like the fact that the province of Alberta was the first one in March of 2014 to say, we are going to change the curriculum in every public school in the province to include the study of the history and culture of Indigenous people, including the history of residential schools. Didn't have to do it, and they did. So now we are watching a movement across this country. A strange thing, because politics, we don't count that much. But here are prime ministers, provinces making commitments, universities making commitments. The institutions are ahead of the general population. The general population, a huge percentage of Canadians, you ask them about reconciliation, they say, what? Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Don't know about that either. Okay, so not everybody's there, but the institutions are leading the way in some cases. And so I say, as angry as we are, and as frustrated, and as the lack of trust that we have dealing with so many of these institutions, we have to sort of set that aside. And I wouldn't be here doing this stuff, I tell you, but I spent 10 years trying to learn how to forgive. 10 years, that's how long it took me. From the day that I disclosed that I was sexually abused, it took me 10 years to say, I forgive. So the anger and the rage that I had has been leaving. It's still not gone, because that's part of my nature. I'm impatient, I'm blunt, and I just sort of call it as it is. You know, I go to the charitable organizations, and now, after 2 years of asking them for some support, some funding, I don't want to do it anymore. I'm saying, I'm tired of talking to you. Why do you keep asking me, we'd like to help, how you want to help? You want to make an application? Can you come to this conference and talk to us some more? I don't want to do it anymore. Like, if you have a bag of money and you want to make something good, get a group of us together, we'll tell you how to do it. So National Council on Reconciliation, I think that should be set up as soon as possible. All we need to do is get to the minister and the prime minister and say, let's work on that, let's set up a working group. Our national leaders, our national organizations, quiet working group, start working on it, jointly draft the legislation, and it's done. And we do a 50-year plan. Reinstate some healing money so our communities can continue to do the work that we need to get done on our side. That is what I think we need to do. The call to action that Canadians for a New Partnership was tasked with by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the one to change the curriculum in the public schools across this country. And that is already happening. And I close with saying it is going to be a profound change in this country when we start graduating hundreds of thousands of Canadians out of high school. And every one of them is going to know more than the total sum of what their mothers and fathers, grandparents, and aunts and uncles combined ever knew. about the indigenous people of this country. And that is going to give us the ability to make the kind of changes we need in the time we have. So those are the comments I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much. Merci.
And then they send a rookie up here. Udloriak Udloriak Hanson. Thank you very much for inviting me to the conference organizers, and thank you for wanting to hear the Inuit story, wanting to hear an Inuit perspective. I have pictures playing in the background, and I'm sorry for the distraction. They ran a little bit too soon. But I can turn them off if you want. I'm sure you've seen them go over a few times. But I did want to share, and there's only 33,000 of us in Nunavut, 56,000. I'm going to give you all sorts of little fun facts about Inuit. As we've talked about over the last few days, there certainly is not enough information about Inuit in particular, as well as other Aboriginal groups. I'm proud to say that there's 2 Inuit in the room, Yvonne and my son Robert. And if you want to look at a beautiful example of hope, my son. I tell you, at 21 years old, he's, talk about emotional. He chose to come to this conference on his own, which he has other conferences, because he cares and he wants to provide the Inuk voice. At 21, I got to be there. They don't have any Inuit speaking. They have no Inuit at the panels. They don't have any keynote speakers. I have to be there. That sure makes me very proud. Thank you. I would like to recognize as well that we are in Treaty 1 territory and Métis homeland. And I'd also like to just note how I appreciate this practice. It's different, it's new to me. We don't do it in Nunavut or in our Inuit regions. It's probably because it's pretty obvious where you are when you get there. You have to fly in, and when you get there, it's 85% Inuit. It's pretty obvious whose homeland it is and whose homeland it has been for thousands of years. But you never know, maybe with climate change and people moving up there, and it might be a different story in 100 or 200 years, who knows. But right now, the conversation, one of the conversations Stephen and I had last night was about how it's a blessing in some ways. The Inuit are so far away. Maybe it is and maybe it isn't, because we do lack so many resources, because we are so far away and it costs so much money. But on the flip side, it's more of a slow transgression towards living in this mixed economy. So today I'd like to provide an Inuit perspective, and I just want to clarify that it is an Inuk perspective, not the Inuk perspective. Inuk is short, another fun fact. Inuk is short form for, singular for Inuit. So when I say an Inuk perspective, that's my perspective. Our contact and full-time exposure has been so recent with non-Inuit. My mother was born in an igloo, and she's only 70 years old. So when we're talking about reconciliation, we're really talking about reconciling a relationship that's about 50 to 60 years old. We have all this work to do, as Stephen mentioned, on our generation, our parents' generation, our children's generation, because of this short relationship. It's been damaged right from the get-go. Yes, we've had whalers and missionaries for hundreds of years, but I think what we're talking about today more is about government policies and programs that aim to assimilate. Inuit history pre-contact is actually thousands of years old. However, again, it's this short relationship we need to concentrate on, and these series of unfortunate events. In these rooms and many others, there has been a great deal of discussion surrounding residential schools and the need for reconciliation. Today, I wanted to provide some Inuit context about what other issues Inuit have to reconcile with the federal government. Of course, Inuit were part of the residential school experience. Our lawyers worked quite closely with Justice Frank Igabachi to ensure that the 3,000 plus Nunavut Inuit who attended residential schools were included. I'd like to add also that these traumas were not limited to residential schools. There was horrendous cases of sexual and other kinds of abuse in our day schools as well. But in Nunavut, the cultural destruction wasn't confined to tearing children away from their families and sending them thousands of miles away by plane for months at a time, sometimes years. Inuit are also struggling to overcome forced relocations for the sake of sovereignty. I'm not sure how many Canadians know the Inuit story of how they were taken from northern Quebec and moved to places like Grise Fjord and Resolute Bay. And absolutely no offense to these communities who Inuit have grown to love, but they are desolate, 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 desolate. A lot of Inuit, well, there weren't that many to begin with. There was only about 3 or 4 families per community, but these communities, this is just in the 50s and 60s. This isn't very, very long ago. And I just spoke with the INAC representative, and no offense to INAC, because I know there's a lot of wonderful people that work there, but I spoke with somebody who I've learned to trust and work with quite closely, who was still denying that it happened for the sake of sovereignty. This is from northern Quebec. Why would you move him? I wish I had a map up. Thousands and thousands miles away to a place where it's 24 hours of darkness in the winter. Very few animals, very few wildlife to live off of, and ice and snow. In northern Quebec, there's trees. You know, in Grise Fjord and Resolute Bay, there's no trees. So the Inuit had to learn on their own because they were dumped off because there was one ship a year. And they said, well, come back for you if you don't like it in a year's time. Well, guess what? They weren't given that opportunity to jump back up on that ship the next year. And they lost. They lost family. Some of them didn't survive. Inuit are also still struggling to overcome the disappearance and death of family who were sent south for tuberculosis treatment. Our families were never told where they died or where their bodies were buried. We're still trying to get this information today. My grandmother was sent to a sanatorium in Hamilton. My mother overheard the news that her mother had died from people who assumed she was told formally. So she overheard her mother was never going to return. She was 12 years old. It wasn't until she was 43 years old before she learned where her mother was buried. And it was in reading about it in a magazine. She saw a list of Inuit, and I don't know if many of you know, but Inuit were given a number. And my grandmother's number was E7121. And when she was reading, she said, Josie, E7121, that's my mother. She was buried in Hamilton. Imagine the bittersweetness of reading this and finding out where your mother was buried. Inuit are also struggling to overcome, and I'm sorry I'm running through these stories, but we have a short period of time. Inuit are also struggling to overcome the RCMP slaughter of our sled dogs. Again, something that even our own Inuit, some of them deny that this happened, RCMP denies, but it's well documented by stories, Inuit telling their stories. It's documented by the Dene Truth Commission. The commission uncovered the plot by government to settle Inuit into the communities, into communities. When many Inuit ignored the first calls of government to settle, and give up their nomadic way of life, the government resorted to threatening to cut off their family allowance, which they had learned to become dependent on for ammunition, lard, flour, coming in and going to the communities to purchase this, ones that had already been set up. This forced Inuit to build make-do shacks out of scraps of wood. So too did the threat of taking away this family allowance. My mother's uncle, and this is who she had to live with because her mother had been sent away to the sanitarium, she remembers when they reached the shores of Iqaluit and not having anywhere to live, having to watch her uncle gather materials, anything that he could nail together for his family, my mother's family, and his uncle's family. So we had 3 families in a shack on the beach. And all this because they were afraid to lose their family allowance. Here laid the foundation for our present-day Nunavut housing crises. It's very real. It's very sad. All of this destruction and stripping of dignity, pride, and hope stemmed from government policies and practices. This led to a myriad of problems among Inuit, which you hear all the time with other Aboriginal communities: addictions, violence in the homes, elevated incarceration rates, poor physical, mental, and emotional health, some of the highest, if not the highest, suicide rates in the world, and desperate poverty in our communities. It has harmed our ability to parent and to teach our children to parent. It has very seriously impacted our educational attainment. A whopping 74% of Inuit drop out of high school. How do we reconcile what happened to us historically and move on so that we can be productive and successful and celebrate our culture and our lives? Reconciliation, or Saimachatiginik for Inuit, means to work collaboratively so that injustice is not repeated. At the last session, we discussed around the table what reconciliation meant. And for Inuit, it's not much different, really. I talked about the different injustices, but they're all still just injustices. They were all meant to assimilate us. So when we talk about reconciliation for Inuit, it's pretty much the same. It's about meaningful dialogue, it's about educating, it's being given the opportunity to tell your story. But it's also about things like bringing back language and bringing back our culture and our ceremonies. Inuit steps towards Saimachatiginik have included signing a land claims back in 1993 for Inuit and Nunavut. And reconciliation to us means living up to that agreement. We defined our rights in that agreement. We gave up our Aboriginal title for this agreement. It outlines our relationship, our decision-making authorities, and our rights. Through this agreement, Inuit are the largest private landowners in Canada. We haven't learned how to push our weight around yet in that regard, but we will. We'll figure it out. Just like about the corporate tables that we need to have discussions and dialogues around, we need to learn to speak that language to be able to say, we mean something in Canada. We have something that is of value to others, and until we get treated like every other Canadian, we're not going to come to the table. It is a strange concept for Inuit. Thank you. It's a strange concept for Inuit because Inuit they don't like to consider the fact that land is owned, that that there's an owner to this land. Reconciliation for Inuit means respecting our modern rights, modern treaty rights under these constitutionally protected documents. It means making way for us to make our own decisions. It means self-determination in practice, not on paper. But it also means that we have to have a hard look at ourselves. And this is very, very difficult to do when you're still trying to grieve and heal. It's much easier to point the finger out than in. We have a few things we need to do to work on ourselves, and this includes collectivism. How can we let's celebrate success when our culture and the very, very basis of our being is to be collective? In a community, there's nobody who survived without sharing. A hunter always shared his food, not just with his immediate family, but with the others in the camp. If one family was successful, which meant food, which meant survival, then everybody else in the camp was successful and survived. So how do we reconcile that within ourselves and our society now when we live in a wage economy? When we now have a middle class of Inuit, when people are doing well individually, their families are doing well individually, how do we celebrate their success? It's such a, still 50, 60 years, we're only just learning how to do this. So we are hard on one another. The other thing we have to work on is decolonizing ourselves. And we think about all sorts of examples. We've discussed them over the last couple of days. But we've picked up a bunch of bad habits along the way, in the last few years. We're picking up on what has been always done, the governing way. So we're doing it that way. Our own government in Nunavut that was created out of our land claims is governing exactly the way it did when it was run by non-Inuit. That's not good. Our territorial government is only run by 40% of Inuit. The other thing I wanted to mention, which I'm still working through in my mind, but it's becoming more and more clear, especially with conferences like this, is how we continue to speak English to our children. We think that the only way our children are going to advance and succeed is if they speak English. My parents were told this. That's why they spoke English to me. You want your daughter to go to university, you have to speak English to her. I just had this conversation last week in northern Quebec with the Inuit leader. I wanted to cry. He was the same age as me. I wanted to cry because I thought, my God, is this not the perfect example of how we are still colonizing ourselves by leading ourselves to believe that the best way for our children to succeed in this day and age is to speak English to them? We're only perpetuating what our parents were taught. We need to break that. We really do. So what can Canada do? Justice Berger, Thomas Berger, was commissioned as a conciliator around 2005 to review why we were having such a hard time implementing our modern treaty. We have over 40 articles of wildlife, water, economic development, and employment. Again, it sets out our rights. But it all came back to education. His number one recommendation was a complete overhaul of our education system, because guess what? We inherited it. We inherited it from the government of Northwest Territories. Where did they get it from? They got it from Alberta. And we're still following parts of it. We're incorporating little bits here, little bits there, but it doesn't work. It's not working. It's failing our children. 75% are dropping out. The problem being, we don't have the resources for that overhaul. Federal government says now, and has said for a number of years, that it's a provincial territorial jurisdiction. The report that he released fell on deaf ears. In short, our short history with formal education we have had has been residential schools and now this territorial jurisdiction, which again is inherited. We need to educate our children in our language. Where else in the world are you going to find children going to school every day in a language that is not their mother tongue, except for in a First Peoples community in Canada? It's just wrong. And when we talk about what we want to talk to our politicians about, what do we want to push them on, this is a very difficult one. This is really difficult, but it's how much money is put into a language like French. No offense to French people, please, no disrespect. How much weight and energy and resources went into saving and promoting that language in Canada. It worked. We have a lot of people who speak French who would never have done it. But we need to do that for our own Indigenous people. We need the federal government to say something's wrong here. We need to change our policies to ensure that what makes us Canada? Everyone always says it's our diversity. What started first? Indigenous peoples or Canada? Canada's 150 years old. How old are our Indigenous languages? So we need to have these difficult conversations. And we're, Inuit especially, we're shy to make other people feel bad, like French people. But it's not about making French people feel bad. It's about making the government feel bad for having done this in the first place. I just want to end on education again, because I honestly, if we had the weight and resources put into language that we should have in the very beginning, then we wouldn't be having this discussion. But education has to be a joint effort. We have to have all hands on deck. We need federal support for the provincial and territorial delivery of Inuit content. Nunavut was created in 1999. After almost 20 years, we haven't got it right yet. Why? Because we are trying to do it on our own. We think we could do a better job on our own. Well, we need help. We need support. And that's okay to admit this. We're all here today because of a recognition of need. It feels like we are just coming to a realization that we can't do it on our own. Canada, too, is admitting now that it can't do it on its own. Canada can't continue to try leading as a first world nation with poverty-stricken communities. Reconciliation for Inuit will require everyone working toward an education system that reflects and respects our language and culture. Reconciliation is a nation-building exercise. So too would be an investment in our education for our children. Thank you.
So you can see why I'm very fortunate to be working with colleagues like these. So I'm not sure that I have anything worthwhile to say. I admit that. But I will try to add a couple of things. First of all, I would say that what struck me most profoundly about the conference was our opening evening. We heard from Wob Canoe and we heard from Cindy Blackstock. And Wob talked to us in part about holding ourselves accountable. He suggests that we ask ourselves every day whether we've done enough to achieve reconciliation. Cindy asked my question, and at the table that I was at earlier, I said it was the the most important question to me, and that is, why doesn't Canada do better when it knows better? I think she was talking primarily to non-Indigenous Canadians when she said, it's our responsibility to insist on justice. So when I look at those pathways to reconciliation based on my experience and what the TRC has done, I think of it in terms of three broad pathways reflected in the calls to action. The first and most important, in my view, my experience as a public servant, is, to quote the Minister of Justice, to complete the unfinished business of confederation. And to me, this pathway is reflected in the call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. On another occasion, the Minister of Justice said, what we need to do is breathe life into Section 35 of the Constitution. That's what we've been trying to do since 1982. Now is the time to get it done. The second pathway is the closing of the socioeconomic gap between First Peoples and other Canadians. And that's reflected in those first 42 calls to action under the heading Legacy. And the third pathway necessary to support and allow success in the other two is this emphasis from my colleagues on education, and importantly, public education. So I think what Cindy did, well, Celeste McKay, in one of the sessions there yesterday, did a really good analysis of the Prime Minister's mandate letters to his ministers. And I won't duplicate that, but I will turn to one quote. The Prime Minister's mandate letter to the Minister of Indigenous Affairs states that her overarching goal will be to renew the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. This renewal must be a nation-to-nation relationship. So, and as it goes on to say that she must implement the 94 calls to action and the 46 articles of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. But yesterday, one discussion, again, for we non-Indigenous peoples, for Indigenous peoples as well, Craig Benjamin was reminding us, we have got to stay vigilant. We've got to watch for the weasel words. He has another term for it, but I'll call them weasel words. He talked about a concern about language like within implementing the UN Declaration, but within the Canadian Constitution and Canadian law, and the potential to use that kind of language to water down the full commitment to that declaration. So one signal that implementing that is going to be tough. The Minister of Justice, an Indigenous person, has acknowledged that it's going to be challenging. During the emergency debate on at Awabascat a few weeks ago, she called the development of this nation-to-nation relationship one of the most challenging public policy issues of our time. Because it's going to take us back to some tough issues that as I've said, we've been grappling with for the last 34 years. Issues like self-determination and where Indigenous governments are going to be sovereign in their own sphere. Issues like treaties, which has come up several times from Indigenous peoples throughout the conference, the treaty issues. Some say implementation of the treaties, finally implementing. Some say renewing the treaties. But most would say doing it on the basis of spirit and intent. Challenging issue. And the issues of free, prior, and informed consent, which to my mind, again, as a non-Indigenous person, is just speaking to the importance that the TRC put on education and public education. Because if we are going to have progress this time, those are the things that are going to facilitate that progress. Now, Cindy reminded us quite eloquently of two opportunities that we missed in the last 20 years. She mentioned briefly the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that laid out a full framework for Canadians, but that framework was never seized. I think I was deputy minister at the time. I think we started with goodwill, good intentions. But if Canadians, if civil society is not vigilant, then deputy ministers change, ministers change, and before you know it, the Royal Commission slides down the priority list of government, and we ask ourselves 20 years later, what happened? Cindy, of course, talked primarily about the financing of child and family services. And yesterday, Naomi Metallic reminded the members of one discussion group that it's not just about child and family services. The underfunding of services to First Nations is across the board. And again, why? Well, in large part, it's because in 1996, the government implemented a 2% cap. Now, I'm not implying that services were equal at that time, but we were at least making progress. But in an effort to fight that deficit, we were called upon to introduce a 2% cap. Now, the deal was, when the deficit is defeated, which it was in 2004, we commit, what I told First Nations leaders, our commitment is to lift the cap and sit down with you and discuss a fair rate of growth and a fair system of fiscal transfers to First Nations governments. 2004 came and went. That didn't happen. Prime Minister Martin sat down with provinces and ease the deficit impact on them, but he did not do that with First Nations. National Chief Phil Fontaine, because of the urgency of the issue, began to talk for the first time about this question of closing the gap in socioeconomic circumstances. That led to the negotiation of the Kelowna Accord, 2006, a $5 billion investment and a very thoughtful, negotiated approach to improving services to First Nations people, Inuit and Metis people. But all of a sudden, Jack Layton brought down the government. The Conservative government was elected. Kelowna was not honored. Where was the public outcry? Indigenous leaders have a right to ask that question. I asked that question as a Canadian. It undermines my faith in this country. So I don't want to belabor the point, but it's simply to underscore the importance of us holding ourselves to account, each other to account, and the government to account. Now, in this particular case, in the last budget, the government lifted the cap. If we're not careful, if we're not vigilant, if we don't really care, that's a perfect excuse to say, well, work is done, the cap is lifted. The work is not done. As you pointed out yesterday, there's all kinds of work. We do not know the level of deficit that some of these service areas have fallen into. We haven't had the discussion about the choice of instrument that First Nations and others want to use to have fiscal amounts transferred to them. There is no plan. So we non-Indigenous peoples who care about these issues, we have to be vigilant to make sure that the government produces that plan in discussion with Indigenous peoples. And we've got to look for the signs that they're not happy with the outcome of those discussions. And we know that Cindy is not happy, that the government has not replied to the findings, the judgment of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. What are we going to do about that? We can all commit to have our organizations do something about that, to do something about that personally, to write to our members of Parliament and say, what the hell is going on? So, part of what we were asked to do was to talk about next steps and to draw some, and I'm not sure that I'm going to do a very good job of this. I have to say, it is a sign of a good conference when many of the things you had in mind have already been discussed. I mean, I'm reassured by that. But I did want to make a couple of points. Rye mentioned, looking at the board, the importance of transparency. I know we had that discussion yesterday about about a reconciliation barometer, but I really want to underscore this point about government transparency. The only reason we know the full truth about the fiscal damage that is being done to First Nations is because Cindy Blackstock obtained a deck that was on its way to cabinet on the basis of access to information. That's not right. We're dealing here with First Nations peoples. They have a right to know the information about federal funding and where it is less than that funding provided by provincial governments. They have a right to know that comparator. We have to insist on greater transparency. Now, as I say, many of the things that I wanted to say have already been said. My RCAP experience reinforces the message that my colleague Stephen delivered about the importance of that National Council of Reconciliation. I've looked back. RCAP did recommend such a mechanism. I regret the fact that I was not wise enough to take that and put it into the cabinet document that went forward on gathering strength, the federal government's response to RCAP. Because at least if it had been there, we would have been getting public reporting from time to time on progress on that issue. I want to reinforce another thing that Stephen said. I'm new to the civil society, but a young lady yesterday mentioned the importance of networking among youth. And I think Stephen mentioned that. I do think that's important. We've talked to Rye and others about it. If we are going to do this job of public education, if we are going to work together effectively, I think we need to increase our networking. We need to understand what one another is doing, and we need to reinforce those messages. And as a non-Indigenous person, I have one last thing that I wanted to say, is that I think again, it's repeating something that Stephen said. We non-Indigenous people, many of us have heard the calls to action. We want to act on them, but it's got to be done in a respectful way. We need to have those linkages with Indigenous organizations so we learn where they want to go and we can support them in that direction. So we need to increase that kind of communication. The final thing that concerns me is something that Marie Claude Landry mentioned in another panel discussion yesterday. She was looking back at this recent Environics poll that did come together because we networked on the issue. And I urge you to have a look at that poll. We've got to study that poll and figure out the implications. And one of the things she noted was this, excuse me if I get the figures wrong, but 85% support for moving forward with the TRC, but only 15% of non-Indigenous Canadians could cite a TRC call to action. See, I mean, that's, for me, the lazy kind of approach to reconciliation that is not going to get us anywhere. I'm frustrated by this, and two things give me a sense of a hope. I rely on a quote by Prime Minister Trudeau's father, who said at one stage, I think he was saying Canadian citizenship isn't easy. And he said, you know, a country is not like the pyramids. You build the edifice and you leave it standing there for all time. A country like Canada, you've got to build day to day based on shared values. So Canada is hard work. And we've got to tell our fellow citizens that reconciliation is going to be hard work. You've got to take the time to look at the federal budget. Or if you don't have any inclination to that, find the organization that you trust that can tell you that story. But do not let children be underserved. Bobby Joseph, so many others have cited those socioeconomic, Cindy, Naomi the other day have cited those statistics. We cannot allow that to continue. There must be urgency on, I believe, on this issue of equity, socioeconomic comparability. So I'm going to close. I'll close with this. Because, I mean, Wob reminded us that this is going to be a difficult journey, and he said, you know, I think this was his way of saying make a personal commitment. He challenged us. Look in the mirror every morning or every evening and say, have I done enough today on reconciliation? So I, for one, accept Wob's challenge. Thank you very much.